This is the last voice thread in this series in the Ecology 1 module. And this voice thread is about species interaction. We're going to pick it up where we left off in the previous voice thread, looking at what happens when niches overlap. And then from there, we're going to look at other ways in which two species that are in the same habitat at the same time, how those species can interact. And the particular picture that I have here, by the way, is a wonderful early spring wildflower called the windflower, or Anemonella thalictroides. And this is a real common little wildflower that lives out in our forests here in the state of Tennessee. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful way to start this last voice thread. All right, we're getting back to this idea of what happens when you have, and you'll recall we had species B, and species B had a certain amount of niche that we identified like that, and then we had species D come in, and species D almost completely overlapped species B in terms of its niche. And we said this represents a really big problem, and it's one that kicks in the principle of competitive exclusion, but since there's so much overlap, that resource partitioning is not going to solve it. And so now we have another principle that kicks in that's going to operate to solve this problem. Instead of resource partitioning, what's going to happen is something called competition. And we're going to see competition develop between B and D, and at the conclusion of this competition, only one species is going to be utilizing the resources and the interactions in that niche, in that particular place, at that particular time, which is to say, one of these guys got to go. Turns out that there's two basic types of competition that takes place. The first type is called exploitative competition. Exploitative competition. Now, in exploitative competition, two individuals, two species are trying to utilize the same resource at the same time, trying to utilize the same niche at the same time. But if one of them is better adapted, if one of them is more efficient, if one of them is better at using the resources than the other, then we say that that one species, the one that's better, it can exploit the niche better than its competitor, and whichever species can exploit the niche better, more efficiently, that's going to be the one that gets to stay. And the one that's not as efficient, that can't utilize the resources within that particular niche that they're competing for, if it can't cut it, it's going to have to go. And so exploitative competition, the one that's better at doing what they do and utilizing the niche, that's the one that's going to stay. If you think about it, this is an awful lot like when you go to get a job. In an ideal world, who should get any particular job that's offered? Well, the person that's the most well-suited to it. Okay? The person who's the most qualified should get the job. And that's kind of what's happening in exploitative competition. You have two species trying to do the same thing in the same place at the same time. If one of them is better at doing those things, then that one is going to get more of the resources, and it's going to do a better job, and the second one's not going to do so well, and it's not going to be able to survive and exist alongside or along with the first species. So in exploitative competition, we have two organisms. One of them is more efficient, then it's going to be the one that gets to stay. It can exploit the niche better, and its competitor can't, and it's going to have to go. The second type of competition is called interference competition. Now, in interference competition, you have two organisms. They're trying to do the same thing in the same place at the same time, but one of them can block or prevent access to the resources. And if one organism can prevent another organism from utilizing the resources, even though it might not be any more efficient, but if it can physically block or interfere with the other species, then it's going to be the one that gets to stay. A very good example of interference competition involves a particular invasive exotic plant that I've already mentioned in a previous voice thread, and that plant is called, of course, privet. Privet engages in interference competition, and it does this because privet is an evergreen shrubby species, so its leaves are green all year round. Well, if its leaves are out and green all year round, what is not getting down to the ground level? Well, there's not very much sunlight that gets down there. The privet intercepts it before it reaches the ground, and that makes it very, very difficult for any other kind of plant to grow up around the privet. The privet shades out its competition by interfering with the competition's ability to acquire sunlight. Another example of interference competition also involves an invasive exotic species, and that happens to be a bird called the starling. Now, starlings were introduced intentionally from Europe. This was a huge mistake. In the early 1900s, by the middle part of the 1900s, the starlings had spread almost all the way across the country. We have lots of starlings here in Tennessee. Starlings nest in holes in trees. They're what we call cavity nesters. Well, it turns out that there are lots of species that nest in tree cavities, tree holes, and one of those happens to be the eastern bluebird. It turns out that starlings and eastern bluebirds like the same size cavities with the same size openings. They don't make their own. They use naturally occurring cavities. And the problem, though, so now we have competition for nesting sites between starlings and bluebirds. The problem is that the starling is a very belligerent bird, and it can literally evict a bluebird out of an existing nest hole. In fact, starlings have been observed to go in, chase off the parent birds, go in, toss out any little baby bluebirds that might be in there, and take over that nesting hole for themselves. Not a very nice thing to do. The problem is the bluebirds, they just don't really have the capacity to do anything about it. The starling's a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit meaner. As a result of that, bluebird populations dropped very low in the eastern United States. And so people started building boxes for bluebirds, and a lot of times driving around out in the country, you'll see these bluebird boxes on posts, on fence posts, or you can hang them on trees and things like that. It turns out that the starlings don't really like to use those as much. The poor bluebirds don't have a whole lot of choice, but that particular size and dimensions of nest box works for them. And so the bluebirds use the bluebird boxes, and that's one reason, by the way, if you go to build a bluebird box, there's specific measurements and dimensions that you need to use, because you want to make sure that the bluebirds will use it, but the starlings and other species won't try and use it. And so the bluebirds use the nesting boxes, and as a result, bluebird populations are coming back, and that's a good thing. You probably noticed that there's another really long, lots of syllable word left on this voice thread page, and that word is allelopathy. And I happen to like that word because it's a lot of fun to say, allelopathy. Well, it's more than just fun to say. It's also a very interesting concept. Allelopathy is a type of interference competition that is utilized or done by certain types of plants. In some situations, plants are growing and there might be some resource that's pretty scarce. And as you can see in the photograph on this page of the voice thread, Well, what resource do you think is scarce in this particular habitat? Well, hopefully you said, doesn't look like there's very much water. Okay, water is kind of in short supply in this desert area. And so it's to a plant's advantage to not have any other plants growing around it where it will compete for the water. And so these plants in this photograph, you can see that we have a plant here. Okay, I need another color. Let's try this color. And plants here and a plant here. And between these plants, there's a lot of space. Okay, there's open space between these plants. Okay, well, these plants are called sagebrush, and that open space is caused by allelopathy. How do they do it? Well, what they do is they release chemicals into the soil that inhibit the germination and growth of other plants nearby them. Allelopathy is a form of interference competition that utilizes chemicals. In fact, it's almost a type of chemical warfare. The plants release the chemicals, they can release them into the soil. Some plants release these chemicals into the air, and they drift down and reach the ground in the vicinity of the plant, and they either kill or prevent the growth of other plants within that region where that chemical is. This is called allelopathy. So in the desert Southwest, where competition for water is pretty fierce, allelopathy is an important way in which plants can sort of maintain their own little personal space around themselves, and they have control over all the water that falls within that particular space. And they do that by releasing these chemicals. In the eastern United States, and here in Tennessee, we've got some allelopathic plants as well. Not quite as many as they do out west, but two species that are allelopathic in Tennessee are the black walnut tree, and a lot of people who have black walnut trees growing in their yard know how difficult it is to get grass to grow under them, and it's because they release chemicals into the air. Their roots also release some chemicals, and when the black walnuts are ripe and they fall from the tree, they have this real thick green-brown husk on them, and they have a very strong smell. Part of that is those allelopathic chemicals. Another allelopathic plant that we have in the eastern United States is called the tree of heaven. It happens to be an invasive exotic species, so it's not a good plant to have, but it is also allelopathic, and it releases chemicals, I believe, into the soil that inhibit other plants from growing around it. So allelopathy, a special example of interference competition that's practiced by certain kinds of plants that have evolved the ability to release chemicals into their environment that inhibit other plants from growing around them. Now we're going to take a look at what happens when two organisms begin to interact, but instead of partitioning resources, as we saw a little in the previous page of this voice thread, or instead of competing for resources, like we saw in this particular voice thread, what happens when two organisms interact and one of them becomes resources for the other? Well, that's the topic of the next page of this voice thread. When two organisms interact and one organism becomes a resource for another organism, this is referred to as a predator-prey interaction. Basically, what's happening is one species is eating the other one, and the one that's doing the eating, the eater, is the predator, and the prey is, well, essentially the ET. It's the one that's getting eaten. Okay, so here we have a kitty, some kitty cats, and here we have the mouse, and this has all of the potential to become a predator-prey interaction. The mouse is sweating a little bit here. Now, there are some important things to consider when we're talking about a predator-prey interaction. And it is important to keep in mind that everything in an ecosystem, everything in nature, everything comes down to the idea of energy. And let's face it, the predator is trying to get energy from its prey. It's acquiring energy from the prey that it eats. But think about this. In order for the predator to acquire the energy that's in the prey, what is that predator going to have to do? It's going to have to expend energy. And so we have this idea of it takes energy to get energy. In a predator-prey relationship, it takes energy to get energy. This has some very significant implications and has led ecologists to come up with something that they call optimal foraging theory. Optimal foraging theory. And actually, optimal foraging theory not only explains a lot in the ecosystem, it explains a lot in our lives as well. Basically, humans are predators, and we engage in this as well. And, well, here's how it works. Let's say we've got a lion or a pride of lions, and they're checking out a herd of gazelles because lions like to eat gazelles. So lions are the predators, gazelles are the prey. Now, lions, being big cats, they are stalking their prey, they're looking it over, but are they looking it over and saying, oh, wow, there's a nice big, juicy, healthy gazelle? Are they looking for the biggest and the fattest and the yummiest and the healthiest and the tastiest ones? Well, probably not. What are they really looking at here? Well, they're looking out there and they're saying, ooh, there's one that's limping. There's one that's kind of wheezing a little bit. Okay? There's one that looks a little sick, or that's old, or that's young and inexperienced. Okay? What are they looking for? Why are they interested in the injured or the weak or the sick or the old or the very young? Well, they're interested in those because they are the easiest to catch. A predator is always interested in the meal that is easiest to catch. They are looking for the easiest meal that they can get. So the one that's the easiest to catch, that's the one they're going to go after. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because if they're going after the one that's easy to catch, that means they're minimizing expenditure of energy and they're maximizing their gain of energy. So in other words, you want to use as little energy as possible to get the most energy that you can. And that's the idea behind optimal foraging theory. Basically, you go after the easiest meal. Think about people for a minute. Don't we do this as well? When you get done with at school, or you've had a long day at work and you get home, and what's usually the first question out of your family's mouth? The kids all gather around and they want to know what? What's for dinner? And so after a hard day's work, are you going to go into the kitchen and get out the pot roast and get out the potatoes and peel them and boil them up and whip yourself up some homemade rolls and put together a salad and bake an apple pie and brew the iced tea? I'm getting hungry. And get out and put the tablecloth on the table and set out the china and bring this wonderful meal to your family? Right. Who are we kidding? We're going to call in for pizza. The entire pizza delivery industry is based on the fact that human beings use optimal foraging theory just like lions looking for a tasty gazelle for lunch. We go after the easiest food, the maximum gain for the least expenditure. The entire fast food industry is based on this idea of optimal foraging theory. I mean, what could be easier? You don't even have to get out of your car. You hand them a few green pieces of paper and you get a whole bunch of calories. It just doesn't get any better than that. So, you know, we do it too. We do it too. Now, we've all seen the videos on TV, on the Discovery Channel or Animal Planet or whatever, where the lions or the cheetahs are chasing down the poor little gazelle and they jump on its back and they rip it down to the ground and they rip it all to pieces and they're roaring and there's blood all over and everybody comes in and they're chowing down and people go, oh, that poor little gazelle didn't have a chance. Well, what they don't show you are the rest of the times when the lions missed the gazelle, and actually the predators certainly don't have it all their own way. However, predators perform a very important function in the ecosystem. One of the effects of predators on prey populations is something called culling. The predators cull the prey populations by removing the weak, the injured, the diseased, the old. They are removing individuals from the population that are probably using resources, food or whatnot, but they themselves are not necessarily contributing to the population, usually in terms of reproduction. And of course, if you've got several diseased individuals in a population, the predators taking them out means that the rest of the population is less likely to have to deal with that disease. And so the idea of culling means that the prey population as a whole is actually improved. Things are actually a little bit better for the population as a whole. Although for the individual that gets eaten, well, maybe not so much. The idea of optimal foraging kind of reaches its height when a leopard or a lion or a cheetah or one of these big magnificent predators is working its way through its habitat and it happens to find an animal that's already dead. Most predators, now not all predators, but most predators, if they find one that's already dead, they are not going to pass it up. If something dies of natural causes out there in nature, that attracts a tremendous amount of attention, and the predators are going to be on the spot quickly, and this is something called scavenging. And if you think about it, scavenging is about as close to a free meal as you're going to get. If you find, you know, what's a predator's favorite thing to find? One that's already dead, because now zero energy expenditure in acquiring, and you're getting 100% return. You're getting all of the energy in the eating. So if it doesn't cost you anything to get it, that's like gravy. That's what they really, really would prefer to do. Sometimes you'll notice that maybe something will die. In a lot of these documentaries we see out on the African plains, you know, a giraffe dies or a zebra dies or something, and a lot of times it's the little predators that come in, the little jackals and wild dogs and things like that, and then pretty soon the lions show up. Now you'd think, wow, these little jackals, they got it made, you know, they got this whole thing to themselves, and here come those lions. Boy, they need to defend that carcass. Well, maybe. Typically what happens, though, is that the smaller predators, they'll put up a little bit of a show just to save face, but they aren't going to in any way endanger themselves trying to defend a carcass. Because if you're trying to defend it, there's always the chance that you could get hurt. And the last thing you want to do is get hurt, because now it takes energy to heal, and that's energy that you can't acquire because you're hurt. And so predators will do anything they can to keep from being injured, because that's a lot worse than just giving up a carcass to a bigger predator and having to find something else later. Live now, fight later. Or eat later. That's words to live by. And typically the large predators don't eat everything anyway, and there's going to be plenty of leftovers for the little guys. There are three more species interactions that we're going to take a look at, and these go by a general term, symbiosis. Symbiosis. And well, here we got bio here, so we mean life going on here. Sim is a word that means together. And so symbiosis literally means living together, living together. And there's three examples of this that we're going to look at in these last few pages of this voice thread. The first example of symbiosis that we're going to look at is called parasitism, or sometimes referred to as parasite-host relationship. This is very similar to predator-prey in that one species is using another species as resources. The difference in parasite-host as opposed to predator-prey is that the parasite is not intending to kill its host. In predator-prey, the predator is going to kill the prey and eat it. In parasite-host, the parasite, in the role of a, quote, predator, unquote, is going to be utilizing resources from the host, but it's not intending to necessarily kill the host. And once again, our old buddy optimal foraging theory is still operating, and that makes sense. Is it in a parasite's best interest to kill its host? Probably not, because then the parasite's going to have to what? Go find another host, and that requires energy. All right, some examples of parasites. Well, here we have one that's probably familiar to you, a mosquito. Mosquitoes are parasites on generally warm-blooded organisms like you and me, and I know that you have experienced those guys before. Another example of a parasite might be something like a tick that gets into your skin and is sucking your blood. Another example of a parasite might be something like a leech that attaches to your foot while you're swimming in the river or something like that. There are a lot of internal parasites like the malaria parasite that gets inside of you and causes malaria, or you might get a tapeworm or something like that inside of you. That's a parasite. Lots and lots of examples of animal parasites. There are also parasitic plants as well. In a previous voice thread, I mentioned a plant called dodder when we were talking about the kingdom Plantae. Dodder is a plant that is a parasite. Another plant that's parasitic, it's actually kind of partially parasitic, but it's one that's not at all uncommon in Tennessee, is called mistletoe. And you see this as a green bunch of plants that's growing in the top of a tree. And the mistletoe has roots that go into the tree and remove water and mineral nutrients from the tree. It does photosynthesis, so it does kind of make its own food. It's kind of still an autotroph, but it acquires resources from its host, and so it's also a parasite. Now you may be wondering why I've got a picture of a bird's nest over here with some eggs in it. Here's some baby birds. Well, remember back when we were talking about the kingdoms of organisms, the living players in the ecosystem, and for Animalia I had a brown-headed cowbird. And I told you that brown-headed cowbirds do something that's just wrong. This is just unbelievable what these guys do. Brown-headed cowbirds, and a few other species as well, engage in a really, really bizarre and interesting behavior called nest parasitism. What they do is the female cowbird lays its egg in the nest of another bird species. So the male and female cowbird, they go out in the bushes and, they do what they do. And then the female cowbird looks for a nest that has some eggs in it, and the female cowbird lays her egg in that nest. Now that egg develops very, very quickly, and oftentimes it will hatch before the other eggs do. And if that happens, the baby cowbird has an instinct to try and push these eggs out of the nest. Oh my gosh, how awful. If perchance the other eggs hatch before the cowbird has a chance to do that, well, the cowbird baby typically is going to, here's the baby cowbird's typically going to be much larger than, say, this baby robin right here. Okay, and here's another little baby robin. And of course, mama bird is out here and daddy bird are out here. They're looking for bugs to feed to their baby birds. And when the parent bird comes back to the nest with a beak full of bugs, the baby birds start begging for the beak full of bugs. And so they open their beak real wide. So here we see the robin beak, and here's another robin beak down here. But the parent birds, they're basically looking for the biggest beak. And in this picture, this beak right here is the biggest beak, and that happens to belong to the cowbird. And so that's going to be the beak that gets fed. As a result, the cowbird grows faster, it gets most of the food, and these poor little guys here are not going to make it. Why in the world do the robins do this? Well, they don't call them bird brains for nothing. Birds are not exactly the most intelligent of organisms. So the birds do this, and it doesn't even click in. Their just instinct is stuff bugs in the biggest beak in the nest. And so think about this. Oh my goodness, the cowbirds have all the fun making the eggs, but none of the work in raising the babies. Optimal foraging theory at its height. It's just wrong. The second type of symbiotic relationship is one where two organisms interact, and one of them is going to benefit from the interaction. One of them is going to come out ahead. The other one, well, it's not really going to care one way or another. It's not really affected and is not really bothered by this interaction. So we have one benefiting, and the other one really doesn't care. Here in the plant world, we see this fern. This is a resurrection fern right here, and it's growing on the trunk of a tree. And it benefits growing on the trunk of the tree by being a little bit closer to the light, further away from potential herbivores that would want to eat it. And so it's got a benefit to growing on this tree trunk. The tree, on the other hand, could care less if it's got a fern growing on it. It's not really interacting with or interfering with the big tree at least in any way that we can discern. And we call plants like this fern that grow on other plants, we have a name for that. These guys are called epiphytes. Epiphytes, and that literally means upon plants. And so epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants. The moss over here, well, we consider that an epiphyte. The fern, poison ivy growing in a tree, epiphyte. there are lots of examples of epiphytes. There are examples of commensalism in the animal world as well. There is a type of fish in the ocean that I'm sure you've all heard of called a shark. And sharks swim around all day looking for something to devour. But there's another kind of fish called a remora. A remora, also known as a shark sucker. And these guys have a modified fin on their back that they can use to attach to the belly of the shark. Draw a really awful shark here. Okay, the remora attaches to the belly of the shark, and the shark swims around and the remora just tags along for the ride. Doesn't bother the shark any. They're real big and it doesn't make a difference. Remoras aren't that big. And so the remora is not really bothering or slowing down the shark. When the sharks find something to eat, they yum, 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 rip, 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 shred, 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 and there's going to be shreds of the prey in the water. And at that point, the remora will detach, and it's going to come and it's going to feed on these scraps that are left over after the shark is done feeding. And then the remora, when it's done feeding on the leftovers, attach back to the shark, head on to the next meal. So the remora is benefiting. The shark, really doesn't make a whole lot of difference one way or another to the shark. So this is two examples of commensalism. The last symbiotic relationship that we want to look at is called mutualism. In mutualism, two organisms get together and both of them benefit from the interaction. This is an example of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Both of them come out ahead as a result of having participated in a mutualistic relationship. An example that we have here, this is a type of organism called a lichen. Okay, it's called a lichen. And lichens actually consists of a species of fungi that is growing with a species of algae. And so what we have right in here, this kind of grayish puffy material here, this is our lichen, and it consists of fungus and algae growing together. The fungus, it acquires water, and it can get nitrogen and phosphorus and all those other nutrients from its surroundings. The algae then uses those materials to make food, photosynthesis, that can then be used by the fungi. So they're both helping each other out. They're both doing something for the other. They're both benefiting from this association. We've seen another example of mutualism. Go back and check out the nitrogen cycle and see if you can't figure out what the symbiotic relationship, what the mutualistic relationship is there. Should be pretty obvious if you go back and check out the nitrogen cycle. There are mutualistic species interactions in the animal world as well. We have examples of large animals in the grasslands of Africa. They often have little birds sitting on their backs, nibbling on their little hides. Well, the birds benefit because they're getting a feast of ticks and flies and other insects, other potential parasites that they're eating up. The wildebeest, or whatever it happens to be, benefits because it's getting its parasite load reduced. It's getting its parasites picked off by the birds. So the birds get something to eat, The large animals, they get clean. They get their bodies cleaned of parasites. We see this with fish. There are certain kinds of fish that swim in the mouths of larger fish and remove the parasites. Benefit to the small, cleaner fish is it gets plenty to eat. Benefit, and it also gets protection. And the benefit to the large fish is it gets its parasites numbers reduced, and that makes it a little bit better off. So there is yet another example of mutualism. One more example of mutualism that I would like to mention briefly involves you. You are in a mutualistic, symbiotic relationship with actually quite a number of different organisms, but one of the most important organisms that you are in a relationship with is actually bacteria. And you are in a very close relationship with a particular kind of bacteria, get ready for this, called E. coli. All right, I know what you're thinking. E. coli, that's bad. E. coli is dangerous. E. coli makes you sick and you can die. Well, yeah, that's true. That's true. But, you know, just like there's a lot of different kinds of people out there, and most of the people in the world are perfectly wonderful people, and they're not trying to hurt you. They're not trying to get anything from you. They're just fine trying to do their job and get on in the world. But there are a few people in the world who, well, you know, they kill people, and they go around and cause all kinds of problems. We call them criminals and terrorists. It's the same thing for E. coli. There's lots of different strains, lots of different versions of E. coli, and the vast majority of them are perfectly fine, and in fact are extremely helpful. But there's one, and when you look at his mugshot, the little number he's holding up underneath of it is 0157. E. coli number 0157. That is the dangerous one. I wish when they announced on the news there was an E. coli outbreak and millions of pounds of meat was recalled. Drives me crazy. They need to say there was an E. coli 0157 outbreak and millions of tons of meat were recalled. That would be a lot better. It's that particular strain, the 0157 strain, that's dangerous. Otherwise, E. coli is your best friend. And in fact, E. coli, you've got a whole bunch of E. coli in you right now. It's living in your large intestine. In fact, probably most of the biomass of material that's actually inside your large intestine may very well be E. coli. You know, so some people say other people are full of, you know, well, actually they're full of E. coli. E. coli, it's important. Well, what's going on here? Well, the E. coli is living in your large intestine, and you're eating 3 square meals a day, and it's warm, and it's dark, and it's wet, and here come all this wonderful food its way. And so the E. coli's got a pretty good place to live there in your large intestine. That's perfect habitat for E. coli, right up there near optimal conditions. In exchange, the E. coli is not interested in anybody else coming in and muscling in on their turf, as it were, and they will defend your large intestine. Your colonies of E. coli will defend their turf in your large intestine against any other potentially dangerous microorganisms that might have made it past all of the steps in your digestive process and gotten to your large intestine. And so they will go to war. And now for you, this may not be too comfortable. It involves you getting up frequently and heading towards the bathroom. But that's just E. coli defending you against potentially dangerous disease organisms. E. coli also helps provide you with certain things that your body needs. And one of the really interesting and important things that E. coli does is it synthesizes something called vitamin K. Now you've heard of A and B1 through B12 and C and vitamin D and vitamin E, and most folks think it pretty much stops there, but not so. It actually goes on, and one of the important vitamins is vitamin K. You get a little bit of vitamin K in some of the food you eat. Things like broccoli, they have some vitamin K in it. It's not a whole lot, but some of it is there. You can't go to get you a box of Special K cereal and get your vitamin K, though. That K stands for something else. Most of your vitamin K is synthesized by the E. coli that's living in your large intestine. And right now would be a good time for you to kind of look down there and pat your tummy and say, thanks guys, keep up the good work. Maybe go get you a snack and give them a little reward. Because that vitamin K is extremely important. What vitamin K does is it is one of the factors involved in blood clotting. And when you cut yourself and you bleed, the blood starts to flow. That sets up a chain reaction of chemical reactions in your body to mobilize your body to seal off where that blood is flowing out. And there's a lot of different types of cells that get involved. There's a lot of things that happen in blood clotting. But at one of the steps, at one of the processes in that process of blood clotting involves vitamin K. And if you don't have a lot of vitamin K, then your blood does not clot as effectively. So vitamin K, it's a blood clotting booster, and you got to have it. And where you get it is from your friends E. coli living down there in your large intestine. They're living large, but they're paying some rent, and this is a mutualistic, symbiotic relationship. You're helping the E. coli, and E. coli is helping you. This page of the voice thread, the last page of this voice thread, just gives a quick summary of the species interactions that we've talked about. So here we have two species. We have species A and species B, and if their niches begin to overlap, they're going to engage in certain activities that will work towards reducing that overlap. And so if the overlap is just a little bit, of course you get resource partitioning. If they overlap a lot, then the species engage in competition, and that might be exploitative competition or interference competition. The result of that, though, is going to be one is going to get to stay, and the other one's going to go. If two species begin to interact and one species becomes resources for another, then we have a predator-prey interaction. And once again, one species, usually the predator, is going to benefit, and the other species, the prey, not so much. Then we get into what are referred to as the symbiotic relationships, and the first one of those is the parasite-host relationship, kind of the equivalent of predator-prey, except it's not in the parasite's interest to kill its host. And so the parasite generally benefits. The host, on the other hand, not so much. Then we have a commensal relationship where one organism benefits, it gets something out of it, but the other one is neutral. Okay, it's neither harmed nor helped by the relationship. And then finally, we get our mutualistic relationship where both species are better off for interacting with each other than they would be if they were by themselves. Both species benefit. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. This pretty much concludes the module on ecology, and I hope that these voice threads were helpful to you.